I want to start with a quote to get things moving from Mr. Voltaire, and I'm curious your perception of it. I feel like you'll probably have some thoughts. A quote that I find interesting is, "If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him." So I think it's interesting that Voltaire chooses him. I think that's worth discussing as well, and also the necessity to invent said God if it, she, him did not exist in some absolute manner. What do you think about all that?
I mean, I understand the impetus behind the quote in the sense that one of the things I think we're seeing more easily right now is we had a moment where at least some people thought that if we could just be rational and scientific and we could just get rid of all these superstitions, then we'd be good, we'd be fine, And what we're noticing is that that's not what's happening. People are becoming nihilistic. They're moving into despair. We're noticing we don't have much to hold us together in terms of societies. We don't have things that bind us anymore as we get rid of religion, as we get rid of God. And so I think that that's probably what Voltaire was perceiving, was the notion that we need something above us, something transcendent to unify us, or else we tend to fragment and to scatter. So I think that the intuition behind Voltaire is right. And you see a lot of people, let's say today, uh, taking that very cynically, in the sense that they realize we need something to bind us together. So it could be anything. We could just put something up there, and we just need it, or else we need to celebrate something together. Or else, why are we something? Why are we a country? Why are we a nation? Why are we a family? Why are we a group rather than just a bunch of individuals slamming against each other?
I reflect on that quite regularly. Internally, at a deeper level, I have a sensation of I can have a sensation of aimlessness. And a part of that, I have these various, what I would consider to be illusions of perceived progress. And that's something that I ask a lot. I feel like most people can kind of collectively agree of progress, let's do progress. And then that presents the question of okay, perfect. I love that. Love the morale, but progress towards what? What is our ultimate end goal here? What are we progressing toward?
No, I totally agree that that's definitely a problem, especially in terms of modern kind of atheist progressive narrative, which is that what are we aiming at? Because in order to progress, you need an aim. You need to be moving in a direction, or else you're just aimlessly wandering. And
Yeah.
so the question is, what is it that's happening? It's easier. I think one of the mistakes that we've seen with the Enlightenment and what came after is we had this idea that if we progress in terms of technical knowledge, that is, if we accumulate technical knowledge, then that's similar to the manner in which we're going to progress morally as a nation, as nations, as people. But they're not the same. The accumulation of technical knowledge is not the same as morality or understanding what it is that makes a life worth living. These are not the same thing. And I don't think that we have progressed in that at all. I think on the contrary, I think that we have traded one for the other. We've traded a kind of comfort, technical comfort and material comfort. We've traded that for purpose, and we've traded that for virtue and for a sense that we are moving towards something valuable. And because of it, people are lost. Well, not
Yeah.
everybody, but there's definitely a sense around us. When I look at young people, especially, the despair is palpable.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And so you asked before we press record, why the heck do you have me here? I'm like a theologian, iconographer, philosopher. What does this have to do with this is supposed to be a health thing or something? One, there's I had John Vervaeke on recently, and I know that you guys are close. And one of the things that came up with that was the meaning crisis. We're going through a meaning crisis of, is there some kind of ground to stand on? Or are we just on this kind of slippery, illusory, hollow sensation of progress towards some technological, financial gain, towards what? And I think it's interesting that within disease or dis-ease, probably 100% of diseases, or there's some root of stress involved in that somewhere in the system. And we can address that topically or allopathically and say, aha, here is the tumor. But then you can wind it back And at some point there's something to cause friction in the system to eventually manifest as some type of physical expression of disease. And so when the majority of people that are visiting a hospital are there for something that's stress related, or something that's like psychosomatic, mental,
Mhm.
emotional, lifestyle related, or something that would just pass on its own, but we're seeking out for this pill or solution. At the root there, I feel like we can start to address some of our medical experiences through like this internal lens, and through starting to establish, maybe starting to address that, like that meaning crisis that I personally experience. I feel like
Mhm.
many other people could probably resonate with that. So what do you think about that? Like that internal experience eventually expressing out into a physical manifestation, and some path maybe towards like finding relationship or balance or homeostasis between the two, the internal and the external, I guess, is maybe like why I wanted to have this conversation with you.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think that you definitely, the idea that there is a relationship between, let's say, our own inner direction and the exterior manifestations in the body is definitely something which happens. I think the mistake that we make, especially us today, is that we think that we're going to find that in some kind of like comfort. Like we think we're going to find that in some kind of if I could just be relaxed enough, if I could just rest enough, if I could just, let's say, serve myself enough, like if I could take care of my needs, I need some me time. Like that's the modern way of looking at it. That actually accentuates the problem. And I think that the more ancient solution would have been something like give yourself. If you give yourself, then a lot of those other things, they tend to diminish. Not that you won't be sick, maybe you will, but it won't matter so much because you'll be living a purposeful life, and you'll be living towards because what do you do? What do you want? You just want to live until you're 99 years old and be miserable, and internally, and be physically, you could be physically fit and kind of looking to be relaxed and to live as long as possible. Or it seems like the more ancient vision is something like give yourself. If you give yourself, then you actually might have a very short life. You might have a very short and painful life, but that short and painful life will be bright. It'll be shining. And look at the people that we admire. Like we don't admire we admire people that have done that, right? Those are the people that shine to us like stars, people who give themselves for a cause, who give themselves to others, they become something else. And so the image that we have, for example, in Christianity is actually the opposite of it really is the image of someone who's willing to die for his friends, who's willing to die for others.
Right.
That is actually what brings the real balance. But I
Yeah.
do feel like right now we have a kind of weird twisted version of that, which is trying to heal all my own issues, like heal my stuff, and
Yeah.
then I'll find homeostasis. But
Yeah. There's a book I've mentioned here a bunch of times called Whatever You Think the Opposite by Paul Arden. I think that's comes up in what you're saying now. I think there's like I would think that by focusing on the individual will start to get, become more and more robust and like well developed and complex and content, and all of those things. But in fact, it takes like relinquishing the attachment to the self in order to come back around and heal the self and like grow
mm,
the self. So it's like in the forgetting of the self is actually has the spaciousness to grow and heal and do all the things. But whereas when there's excessive focus on the self and losing that connection outward, then like I feel like the self like suffocates on its self. you
yeah,
know?
but there is a possibility of practicing doing certain practices, on yourself, with yourself, like meditation, prayer,
hmm
some kind of ascesis, when you, and I think people who also do physical activity have a different version of that, which is that you feel your limit. You feel your limit constantly, and you're trying to push further than your limit. Those are practices that can actually help you understand how it works. Like it's not comfort doesn't give meaning at all. Like feeling good about yourself is not the way to go. And people are going to hate hearing that. But actually trying to, anything that makes you transcend yourself is going to start with pain. It's going to start with a sense of disease, exactly, a disease in general. Like I'm not where I should be. I need to kind of move in the right direction. Of course, we can beat ourselves up too, and that's not helpful. Usually beating ourselves up for not being where we want to be is another kind of weird self-centered thing. Like it's a weird kind of moving it back, moving into experience and just feeling sorry for yourself or feeling guilty all the time. That's not the right way to go about it either. But you do need to feel some pain in order to move towards meaning.
Yeah, so back to Vervaeke, something that I learned from him is the origin of the word religion is religio or something of the sort, and it means to bind or to bring together, like to unite, which is also the origin of the word yoga, yoke, union, connection. It's like it like spans across so many different ideologies, this idea of like connection.
Yeah.
And so I feel like the word religion, the word God, the word spirit, spirituality, all of those have so many meanings and kind of like these crusty old barnacles attached to them.
Yeah.
And so that like at the root of most of those words is like, oh, it's pretty good. It's valuable. But then the outside, there's just a lot of
flaky.
A lot of flakes attached to it.
I totally agree.
And now there's a confusion for the flake for the actual like the root.
No, you're right. And it's actually the fault. A lot of it is the fault of the religious people, where they started, I think there was a lot of forgetting, like just a forgetting of what all this stuff is about, and it becoming more and more arbitrary in the modern world. As people became materialist, it's as if a lot of this stuff became arbitrary. So it was like, when you're a Christian, so you believe that some guy died on a cross and now you're going to go to heaven. If you believe that, that's what a Christian is, really? Like, that's it? That's pathetic. Like, that's really lame if that's what it is. But if
it's really cute. It's like childish.
Right.
It's like really beautiful, actually. It's like, wow, like you are a 50-year-old woman or man, and this is like a Disney, which, I think there's a lot of meaning in fictional novels and tales and all that stuff. And they're relating back to that core root truth typically. But I think not having like a pessimistic view of like, oh my God, I can't believe it. It's also kind of like, wow, like that's amazing. Like I find that beautiful.
Well, I think that for a lot of people, having that simple faith could probably be totally fine. But there also needs to be an intellectual version of that. And it has always existed. It was always there. If you read the early church fathers, you read the mystics, like it's all there. It's just that a lot of it has been forgotten. And it's interesting because right now there's an interesting moment, like people like John Vervaeke are part of that, where because of the space where cognitive science is now introducing itself into the discourse, and we realize that we can't escape perception, like we can't escape this experience of the world, and that we can't pretend like it's not there and just talk about science as if it's outside of that. So coming back to this experience, and this experience of qualia, this experience of, of patterns and of embodiment, then we can start to realize what religion is again. We can start to understand it, that we can see that the world presents itself as so multifaceted that unless we have things which bind phenomena together, then everything scatters, especially at the human level. If we don't have ritualization, we don't have story, we don't have orders which bind even yourself, like your own personal self and your family, and then you scale that up, cosmically, then the world doesn't exist. And then you realize, oh, well, that's what religion is. It's the manner in which things bind together. That ends up looking like ritual. It ends up looking like story. It ends up looking like all the things which people think are silly and superstitious, but actually without them, reality scatters. And you can apply it to your life. You realize actually that most of the things you do are ritualized, and there's nothing superstitious about them. Like brushing your teeth is a ritualized act towards a purpose, but you have ritualized acts towards purposes that are higher than just getting your teeth clean, that are about how can we bind together as a group? How can we recognize what it is that we have in common? And then it looks like processions, it looks like circumambulation, it looks like singing together, it looks like all these things which the modern person found silly.
Yeah.
They kind of flow back in.
I feel like there can be like, I mean, like you're saying, like you can't escape religion, you can't escape dogma. Well, you didn't say you didn't say that exactly, but I imagine you probably align with that to some degree, or maybe not. But so today you can see Christianity seems, at least in my bubble of a world that I exist in, seems to be waning popularity of it. You know, there's a lot more like spirituality in quotations. There's
Yeah.
like we're certainly worshiping. You know, we worship our cell phones, we worship our notifications, we worship our financial status, we worship our socioeconomic status, where we're at on the ladder. You know, so we're worshiping
Oh yeah.
a lot, maybe more
For
than
sure.
ever, really.
No, you're
As far
totally
as
right.
like compulsive worship,
Yeah.
we might be at the highest. You know, not that it's a competition, but we may be at like the highest state of worship ever, at least from a lens of like compulsive worship.
Yeah, but there's also like prescribed worship, which is actually pretty strong right now. People don't really realize it, but you know, it's just because people have separated the notion of religion from other ritualized aspects of their life. But if, for example, you realize, you could say that recycling is a form of worship, you know, because you are ritually acting in a way which is prescribed to you from above in order to participate in a story and a purpose together. And so we all, you know, on this day a week, we all put out our separated materials or whatever. And so there is a ritualized procession about that, which is similar to a religious procession. It's just that it's ordered towards something else. And you can say what's different because that's really valuable. Like saving the environment is really valuable. And I would say, yeah, you're right. Saving the environment is really valuable. But us binding together, let's say, under the transcendent source of love, is probably pretty valuable too, right? It probably has a value that is powerful as well. So I think we can re-understand a lot of the practices of our ancestors, even if we're able to notice, like you said, that we worship. And the problem is exactly what you said, is that addiction is a form of worship, especially addiction. It's one of the most easy. If you want to understand worship, like addiction is one of the best ways, because it's a ritualized cycle of attention, you know, and you get possessed by it, and it actually ends up, let's say, reorganizing your life around its attention, right, around its existence. And so it actually uses you as a body in order to make sure that you are sacrificing and propitiating to this god. But you can see how it's like a demon, right? It's like a parasitic god, you could say. It's a god that actually ultimately wants to destroy you. Um, but it can help you understand what worship is, which is that when we would do that, like if a person would go through the beads of their, you know, of their prayer rope or whatever, like that's similar in terms of this binded attention, which is ritualized in order to get you somewhere.
Yeah, there's a quote from Alan Watts. I mean, I think it's from Alan Watts. I've heard it from Alan Watts. It said that we're confusing the menus for the meal. You know, so we're eating, you know, the words duck confit, you know, like chewing on the paper duck confit, but there's no like fat, you know, and omega-3s and like it's just not, there's no calories there.
Yeah.
And so that's the reason that quote's coming to mind, is like I wonder if there is some hierarchy of worship. I think oftentimes we can romanticize the ancients, you know, and romanticize hunter gatherers, and like everything we're doing now is wrong, and
Yeah.
everything that happened yesterday was the way.
Yeah.
it's like what is like, is there like some ultimate absolute better, you know, or is there like, how do we parse apart, like where is the menu, where is the meal? Does
Yeah.
it matter in the first place? Are we all just going to end up in the same place anyway?
Yeah. Well, I think there is. I think there's an objective hierarchy of worship for sure. And you can actually see it kind of playing itself out in the story of religion, or the manner in which religion developed through the centuries. And it does have to do with understanding where the good lies, you could say. What is it, the good that binds us? What is it? You know? And I would say that it moves towards something like love, towards something like compassion, self-giving or self-sacrifice. And I think that you can find that, of course, in Christianity, but I think you see some of that in Buddhism, although it's not personalized so much in Buddhism. But you do find this idea that the highest, let's say the highest value, the thing that should bind us together, is actually paradoxically a giving away. Like it's a self-emptying, and this self-emptying becomes the thing which makes it possible for us to exist as more than just these selfish little beings. And so I think that is a true hierarchy of being. And so you can imagine local gods, for example, in the time of hunter gatherers, that had some function and some power over the group and would bind them together, would give them a totem, would give them some type of identity and characteristics that they could celebrate and participate in. But ultimately, that leads to constant war. Like, it just leads to nonstop war, because these gods are fighting in the heavens, right? These different totems and gods are fighting amongst each other as the tribes fight and are constantly at war. We always forget that the Greeks, even though they saw themselves as being one people, they were always fighting nonstop. Every year,
Yeah.
people would go to war. So the idea of binding towards higher goods, I think, is something which happened for a reason.
As far as like making this conversation actionable towards some directionality in one's life, something that I think I could use more of, and me being like a product of the culture that I've been grown in. I've heard you mention before, and then it caused me to look it up. The Plato's transcendentals, the three transcendentals, is beauty, goodness, and truth, is what I read on the internet.
Yep.
For that. And that, I think, is something that is kind of can easily be forgotten in the modern era, to pick on the modern era. And that's like, I just got back from Greece, thankfully. It was really like an exceptional experience. And we went to various different islands there, and learned about the god Asclepius, the god of medicine, and the way that they approached medicine. And the way that they approached medicine, theaters were built beside or very close to hospitals, which I thought was very interesting. So that concept of theater was like entrenched within medicine. And when you enter into the hospital, it was really beautiful. And there was art, and you'd get into, a body of water, and you'd, cold plunge and hot tub. And, the way that the tour guides described to me was through art, the emotive power of art, and also senses, so like tantra, in a way you could say, maybe that kind of softens up and opens up some space within, like the tour guide said, like the soul, so whatever word you want to put, that deeper part. And I feel like in the modern era, there's a bit of a jump to just what is the physical expression. Now let's like attack that physical expression, as opposed to allowing spaciousness and using some of these softer tactics to kind of go through and open up some space to be able to get into like what lies beneath that outer physical expression. So that's something, I think that was very wordy. But essentially the question or curiosity is from your perception, what do you see that the value in Plato's three transcendentals, beauty, goodness, and truth, in supporting us as modern people, at least from like a medical perspective?
I think you're definitely onto something, and you understand it. It's a good way to understand the moment in which we are now. That is, right now we have exactly this idea that if we're treating the body, like if someone's sick, we're just going to treat the body. So we bring someone to a horrendous place, like a horrendous place of fluorescent lights, and green plastic things, and metal beds that look like prison bars. And that's where we bring people to heal, because
it's crazy.
Right? Because we think that it's like, well, it's just a car, right? We're just fixing a car. So we're gonna bring someone. We're gonna put them in a rooms with several people, and we're gonna embarrass them, have them wear these horrible nightgowns or whatever. Like, everything about it is this reduction of the human person to a machine. And that's exactly the problem. That's exactly the problem that we mentioned a little earlier, which is that with the return of something like cognitive science, we're realizing that no, you can't pretend like there is no experience of the world, and that experience of the world doesn't participate in your in the medical, in your healing. Like for example, the placebo effect is a great example, right? So we believe, every medical doctor believes that there's a placebo effect to medicine, but they try to reduce that effect as much as possible because they want to reduce you to a machine. And if you could prove that augmenting the placebo effect could actually help you heal faster, they don't care because they don't like that idea. They don't like the idea that mind, that experience participates in your experience. And so when they look at ancient medicine and they see the ritualization, they see the drama, like you said, in relationship to the medical practice, they think it's all hocus pocus nonsense, but they still believe that there's a placebo effect. It's hilarious. It's like, why couldn't you use the best of medicine and then create a ritualized drama of practice in which you would enter into the medical relationship as, you know, as a, like you said, like as a being encountering beauty. It's not possible. Like, our world is too gone, at least for now, it's too gone for that. So we're stuck with these horrible cement parking garages that are called hospitals.
Yeah. I wonder, anytime someone uses the term they, my mind always jumps to like, who is they? And then also want is another curiosity. Like, I don't know that I'd love for you to define they in relation to that statement. And then also drawing back on want. So they want to reduce us to a machine. It feels to me kind of just like it is reducing itself to a machine.
So what is the it now in this one?
It would be the zeitgeist, like the totality of culture moving together. And then we have these individual nodes that pop up and they're wearing, a lab coat and their name's Dr. Sanders or whatever.
All right. So let's frame it this way. So the same movement which moved against religio and described religio as being hocus pocus, magic, and superstition, and ridiculous things people did, or things people did that were imposed by power and patriarchy, or whatever, however you want to describe it. The same, let's say, narrative. You could call it like the worst of the Enlightenment narrative, the worst of the materialist scientific narrative. That narrative leads at the same time to parking garage hospitals. Because there's a coherence in the reduction of everything to its material causes that brings about, the medical establishment that we're dealing with. And so it's, of course, it's a side effect. Like, I don't think that Locke and Hobbes thought that we would get to where we are. I don't think that they could have predicted that their ideas about rationality and Occam's razor and these scientific revolutions that we went through would lead us to a kind of dehumanized machine body. But that is what happened in those causes. But like I said, I do think so. You're right. When I say they, I don't mean I can't. It's not the doctors. It's not their fault. It's not even the medical establishment's fault at this point. But it is a movement. Like, it is a line that you can draw from certain changes which happened in history, which brought us to this point. But at the same time, I do think that seeing that now, there are possibilities of alternatives. It's harder in the medical world, but there are other places where someone can do that. For example, the same thing with schools. Like, schools are basically, they're factories for children. Like, they're just factories pumping out children into the world. Now there's a place where someone can find better alternatives, homeschool, private schools, whatever, schools that are more integrative and integrate storytelling and culture and ritual and practice into a child's life, rather than just have them go through the system.
Yeah.
But medical stuff is harder because it's so big, and there's such a yeah, and there's also cranks like that are real cranks that exist in that world of healing too.
It feels to me when I say like the they and like the it and all that, as opposed to personalizing an individual having any type of intention, which that's a question I have as well, as like how much sovereignty do we have in our choices, and how much are we just a part of this collective consciousness, and we're just a barrel of water just sloshing about, and within that, if we are just this sloshing, I don't know if slosh and barrel of water really works as an analogy, but I'll try to force it.
No, but I understand what you mean. Like we're just in the current. Like we're just
We're just in the
basically
current.
going downstream, and
Yeah.
there's not much we can do. We can notice that this isn't pleasant, but it's not easy to understand how to go upstream. Like it's just not that simple.
Yeah. And so it feels to me like perhaps since at one point there was more, nature worship and animism and probably more like matriarchal societies were more common and things of the sort. And then there was a shift. So the metaphoric water sloshing about going to one side. And then I feel like, a la say like maybe Cartesian times or Newtonian times, and kind of entering into like, aha, no, like scientism, this is the solution, and pragmatism, and everything needs to be rationalized, and I need to be able to hold it and measure it, and that is truth. I don't know that culture as a whole is like, aha, like, yes, I think it feels to me kind of like it's just like a pendulum swinging. And right now we're kind of, I don't know where we're at. If it is a pendulum swinging, I don't know where on the swing we are, but we're certainly in some pragmatic, reductionist, rational swing phase. And it feels like there's a yearning to kind of find some center, or maybe wildly swing back to the other side.
Yeah, well, I think you could see the extremes at the same time. So I think that's probably the best way to understand, especially the modern world, is to understand it as extremes manifesting themselves. There is a bit of a pendulum, but you can also see it happening at the same time. So if you look at in the rationalism right after the rational, like the hyper rationalist phase, was romanticism and symbolism and the kind of the degenerate symbolic thinking that we saw, in the 18th, 19th century, which was about fantastical imagination, all that stuff, and the occultism that came with that type of thinking as well. So if you look at the modern world, is both the rationalism, hyper rationalism, and all that stuff, but it's also like weird occultism and Crowley and the return of witchcraft and Blavatsky and theosophy and all that kind of that other side of modernity, which happens at the same time. So right now we could see that the internet is a great example. The internet is a mix of hyper rationality and control and, like furry avatars in the metaverse, which is like complete explosion of rationality into idiosyncrasy in ways that you could never, ever imagine in the past. Like you can be anything that you can possibly imagine in the metaverse, but that's happening at the same time as this hyper rational kind of strange control. And
Yeah.
so I think that's probably the best way, because it would be hard to understand our moment if we didn't see those two things happening at the same time.
And I'd like to at some point probably try to draw it back to some kind of like actionable, what can we do type scenario. But something that I was listening to your podcast with Michaela Peterson in preparation to this one. And one of the things that I heard her saying throughout that seemed like she was kind of like at least acknowledging with herself, historically speaking, and seems like a little bit present as well, leaning towards like rationality and logic and pragmatism as like a safe haven. And I think that that's very common. Like I can notice that with myself. And I think many people, we can oftentimes, not projecting any of this on her, is just something I noticed now, like just back to speaking about me. I think I can lean on pragmatism as a way, because I feel like there's almost like a fear of chaos. And that deeper underpart, like there's a quote that I from Marianne Williamson, who I've also had on here, said our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. And I feel like that undercurrent, that under part, that's sometimes I think in this modern era, that's kind of, it can be like masked by rationale and science and logic and empirical research. And it's not a thing until it's been studied and all the peers have reviewed it. And then we can start to like actually have a conversation.
Yeah.
But there's also this well beneath that. That's like, oh, like perhaps access to, all the power and answers to, everything you could possibly imagine. But I feel like there's a little bit almost like for me, I can notice like almost like a fear or a resistance around that part. And so I'll just lean on science and lean on rationality and lean on, because I don't want to kind of touch the chaos of what's inside.
Yeah. But I also think that it's important. This is something that is difficult because Jungians are popular right now, I guess, in part because of Jordan Peterson. But there's a tendency to confuse two things. Like there's a transrational space and there's a pre-rational space, or there's something like this subconscious, you could say. There's something like supraconsciousness, and those, they can look the same to people that are just trapped in consciousness. But if you read any traditional text from any religion, they clearly demarcate those as not being the same. And so the kind of chaos, the dream kind of chaos, that kind of emotional, romantic feeling that you get is not the same as the sense that things culminate into a unity which is beyond the particulars, right? That there's this drive up towards something which is pulling me beyond the world. Now, I understand why it can seem like sometimes it's the same in your experience, but you could understand the rationality or the rational world is this like buffered space that exists between those two poles. Something which is pulling you up towards, you could say, the way to understand it would be that as an individual, for example, right, if you give yourself to a higher cause, right, that higher cause is not in the individual. It's not there. So if you take the world of the individual and you analyze it, every single aspect of it, you're never going to get the highest cause to which you're willing to sacrifice yourself for. Does that make sense? And so now think of that for everything. Like there's a world of structured causality, but that world of structured causality gives itself up towards higher participations, you could say. And then there's also a way in which it dissolves into nothingness. So you as an individual, let's say, the manner in which you could dissolve into all kinds of idiosyncratic bad habits or passions, or the way you could become obsessed with things and kind of devolve into something which is not rational at all, right? It's like there's nothing. If you analyze you becoming addicted to things, you realize this is not rational. Like this is breaking me apart. It's fragmenting me completely. But that is different from this giving up, you could say, the way in which you participate. I don't know if that makes sense. It's important, I think, because people are right now are so confused. They think that spirituality is this lower stuff down here. Like it's about feeling and about, how I feel about myself or how I feel about others, or these kind of vague intuitions that you get about things. But the world, the higher world, or the world of spiritual participation, is in some ways it's transrational, but once you grasp it, it's super clear. Like it's like the clearest thing you'll ever see. It appears as a beacon of light that's kind of guiding you beyond your limited world.
Yeah. The only issue I have with the idea of like higher and lower, and placing a hierarchy on states of consciousness and like aspects of, I don't know, existence, life, is I think there can be a fragmentation or divorcing or a separation within self through that separation, and the idea that something is higher than something else. You know what I mean?
I understand why you say that, but it's also because this is the issue, the problem of equalizing everything, is that hierarchies don't compete with their levels. That is that if you are a healthy individual and all your thoughts and your passions are joined together, then you will actually become the best part of a higher participation.
Hmm.
So you will actually be a better member of your family if you are united in that, in the individual part. And
Yeah.
so it doesn't compete. That's what cults do. Cults, if you want to know the difference between a real religion and a cult will try to compete with lower levels of participation. Like a cult will say, you have to deny your family, you have to deny all these lower participations. And so it's the same with it's the same with any hierarchy of anything, right? So if you understand, for example, that love is the highest virtue, right? And so you can also understand that being good at something at a lower scale, it doesn't compete with that. So you could be good at your job, but that if you're good at your job, I don't know, like if you're good at making shoes, it's like that good can embed itself in love, because you can do it in a way that serves your community, or you could do it in a way that's selfish and is just to fill your pockets. But there's a manner in which those goods that scale up, they actually don't compete with each other. They
Yeah.
they fit into each other like this beautiful fractal dance, right? Everything kind of embeds itself into the rest.
There's probably some way to literally define the experience of love being like a higher vibratory state. And then within that, it's like, maybe you could relate it to like spectrums of light. And there's been kind of a war against blue light recently. I don't know if you pay attention to things of this
Well,
sort,
with
like
the
where
phones and stuff, like,
yeah, exactly, like where your blue blockers, like the blue light, it's bad, and it's like, well, no, it's not bad. It's just one frequency that serves a purpose. It's just serves a purpose at specific time for specific functions. And so low frequency light and the infrareds and reds and oranges and all that stuff, incredibly valuable. Really high frequency light, the blues and all that, like that's like really valuable. And if we're playing the game where like, oh, I'm tribe blue light, and like, no, I'm tribe orange light or red light, this is better, it's more healthy. It's like, well, the going back to like the original derivative of health comes back to wholeness. So again, like all of this comes back to like, okay, how do we get, if what one's intention is a sensation probably of, I don't know, like cellular function, and satisfaction, probably the conjoining of all of the tribes and being able to actually be able to see that there really is value in all of it, and not kind of casting any of it out, but actually coming through. I'm kind of going out into the weeds here, but I think there's the availability to perceive everything through that lens of love and acceptance, but not necessarily swallow the pill entirely and say, okay, I'm going to see this state or frequency or whatever through love and acceptance, so I'm just going to become that, and that is all of me.
yeah,
Like I'm able to actually absorb and be with all things, but not get trapped in the kind of the tribalistic thing that tends to happen, where we start to create more segregation, more isolation, and then oftentimes it's in the guise of some higher power.
the idea. So in Dante, for example, you see the way that he presents things is perfect. He says that let's say all sin is something like misplaced love, or too much love, or too little love, or not, or love that is kind of twisted. And so the idea is that all things are good if they're properly aligned. Like nothing is bad in itself. That's ridiculous. Like that's definitely not a Christian way of seeing the world. All things are good, and that they just have to be in their proper place. So your analogy of light is a good example. It's like, well, obviously blue light isn't bad. It's just that it has to be in the proper proportion for what a human being is. And you could say that about things that are maybe more human, for example. So you could imagine something like, entertainment is entertainment good or is entertainment bad? And you can say, well, entertainment is good if it's in the proper proportion to other things in your life that are aimed towards bringing all things together in the good. But if you live a life of just entertainment, right, it's like saying, is eating dessert bad? It's not bad if it's properly ordered. But if you
Yeah.
just eat dessert nonstop, then you're going to get sick. Like, it's actually going to affect you. And if you
Yeah.
just spend your whole day watching movies and playing video games, then it's actually going to affect you. But the other one is true as well, right? If you spend your whole day working, if you spend your whole day doing whatever it is that you do without giving room for the things that are also good, then you'll have the same problem from the other side. Well, you're going to become like someone who's super strict with themselves, that doesn't leave any room for some play, let's say, in terms of personal discipline,
Yeah.
is going to crack. Like, they're just, at some point they crack and they kind of collapse.
Yeah. There's another, I'll be less quotatious after this, I think, but there's another quote from Viktor Frankl. He said, something like, paraphrase, something along the lines of those who lack purpose will seek pleasure instead, as like a replacement. And that, I think that kind of turns into like this like hungry ghost type sensation, like this ongoing reaching out for those little hits.
Yeah.
Because there's that lack of foundation of like actually feeling held and supported and a part of a fabric of something bigger than just this self.
Yeah. Well, you could say that that's the drug epidemic in the North America seems to be really a product of the meaning crisis, like a product of people not having direction and purpose. And so kind of spiraling into exactly what you said, into this more and more extreme desire to feel something,
Yeah, we just want to feel.
Yeah.
How are you with feeling? Do you feel like, where are you with all these conversations?
What do you mean with feeling?
Like, do you have any type of like unquenched yearning sensations that I experience, for example?
Oh, of course. I think that's really part of being human,
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just, of course that happens. And I think that it's also, if you're conscious about it and you're aware of it, then you can also realize what it is what that's for. I think especially sexual desire, the thing that once we, one of the things that happened right in the 60s and then ongoing from there, but there were waves of that before in the kind of decadent end of century times, is that we had this sense that if we could just satisfy our sexual desires and proclivities, then, everybody would get along and we'd all be happy. Yeah. But it turns out that if you focus on that, then it's an unlimited source of frustration, because your desires just get more and more idiosyncratic and bigger and more, you need more in order to feel. It's almost like it's the same as drugs. Right? It's like you need more in order to feel taken further, you could say.
The hedonic treadmill.
Exactly. And so if you realize that, then you're like, okay, well, how am I going to deal with this? Right. So for example, marriage is a good way to do it, because it's hard to do it on your own. It's really hard because it's like, but if you're married to someone that you love, that person will act as both let's say a place for your sexual desire, but also a limit to your sexual desire, because it's one person. And it's like, that person has a limit. Like they have especially for men, like if you're married to a woman, like that woman has a certain limit at some point. It's going to start manifesting itself. And so then you were like, okay, so that feeling, then you feel it, right? Then you feel that longing, or you feel that lack or that hole that it's causing in you. And then you can realize that actually the problem is that the sex doesn't fill that hole. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with sex. Like, sex is great, but it's never going to fill that hole completely, because that hole keeps getting bigger for some reason. It just keeps getting more weird and more, idiosyncratic. And so I think that's the real idea of sublimation, you could say, where it's like you realize, wait a minute, that suffering and that longing is energy. It's actual fuel. And I can redirect that fuel towards other things. And you don't even realize that that exists until you feel it, right? If you're just always kind of somewhat satisfied, you're not going to realize that this longing that you have can be redirected, and it can be redirected towards projects. It can be redirected towards, accomplishing some great task. It can be redirected towards prayer. It can be redirected in all kinds of directions. And then you can see almost what that longing is for, actually. So definitely, of course, I have that, and I hope that I'm doing as much as possible to make it fruitful, to make that longing fruitful.
How often do you misdirect that energy into like self-destruction and burning yourself up?
Yeah, probably all the time in little ways. Like, I mean, like little moments. It's not like big things, but it's like little moments where you have a frustration, or you have a sense that you're not getting what you should in terms of care. I mean, it's not just sex, but it's like in terms of love, in terms of attention, in terms of this. It's like you can feel that every day if you're careful to especially when you're in a family and you have all these dynamics. So I would say it happens quite a bit,
Yeah.
but it's like these little moments where you kind of have to wake up, and then
Hmm.
until you wake up, then you end up in these spirals of frustration. But yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a human being, so it happens quite a bit.
The sex one I think is especially interesting because it seems clear that from an evolutionary perspective, it would make sense for humans to yearn to have sex with more than one person. Like, spread the seed, spread the
Yeah,
species, spread the genetics. What else? What else are we going to do?
yeah,
And build shelter. Weather the storm, spread your genes, hunt, do it over again.
yeah,
And then there's like this kind of new world that we exist in, and nuclear families, and social contracts, and agreements that kind of in a way sits on top, but also we're working on integrating the two to make it be whole, make it like be health,
yeah.
make it be religio, make it all of that. But it feels almost like there's two intersecting tracks in that, like your primal carnal urges to spread the genes,
Yep.
and then his, like from an evolutionary perspective, males would be sexually selected based off of those that, like the Genghis Khans of the world, would be more spread.
But it's your insight is great. It's great, but it's important to understand it. That it's important to understand it in terms of these higher goods that we talk about, right? And so sexuality is probably the easiest way or the best way to understand it, which is that at some point we understand that we have to give up that some of that for something which binds us at a higher level. And actually that would be necessary at any scale. Like it would be necessary if you just had one male, like in the human species, if you just had one male that was mating with all the women, and the other males had no access to women, you would have carnage.
Mm-hmm.
Like you would just have fighting all the time. And the truth is that like people idealize hunter gatherer societies, but you can imagine that people were fighting all the time. And I've been in contact with groups that aren't necessarily hunter gatherers, but have more of that kind of ancient pagan way of being. And that's what happens. People fight over girls nonstop. They fight over women all the time. And people will kill for women, And so this is something and so there's a sense in which you can understand that giving up some of that desire towards higher participation in a society, you can understand that that's fractal, that's also what you do in you, which is that you realize, oh, if I just focus on pleasure, then I'm not going to be able to accomplish my goals. And so I have to sacrifice some of that, and I have to redirect it towards something higher, which I perceive as higher, as a higher good. It doesn't mean that those desires are bad or that pleasure is bad. None of that is bad. But I do have to concentrate it and reorient it. And then I realize, wait a minute, actually what I get from above, what I get from that is really valuable.
Hmm.
And the kind of pleasure that I get, let's say, the pleasure of accomplishing something, or the pleasure of intellectual understanding, it's subtle. It's more subtle than an orgasm, but it calls you, like it calls you, and it has a force that's, I think that especially as you get older, like when you're like 17, it's hard to argue with that with someone who's like just exploding with testosterone. But like as you kind of get into your 30s and you kind of get older, you start to see how actually giving up towards these higher participations, they offer you a type of pleasure which is very different, but is maybe even more valuable.
Yeah, my buddy I've had on here called Chris Williamson. I feel like you guys have you done the Modern Wisdom podcast, Chris Williamson?
Don't think so.
Anyways, he's sweet. A term that I got from him is post nut clarity. After you, and everything you're saying is true.
Yeah.
Post ejaculation.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
to be able to like sacrifice that, like before, I feel like this kind of comes back to like, probably a lot of religious philosophies or religions, or ideologies, but like the value of sacrifice, and God sacrificing his only son, on the cross to save us all from his sins. And like, yeah, like the ethics within that, like they've been around for a while. And it seems like, so that's kind of at a more macro, like quote unquote God level. And then individually, I think we can experience that as well. And then I think that's where there is value.
But let me give you just an example based on what you just said, which is that think about, like when I say giving yourself to a higher good. So think about you're in a situation and you could sleep with your friend's girlfriend. Like she's up for it, but you know the consequence of that, right? You know what that's going to cost you. And so you decide that actually the friendship I have, my friend, is more valuable than the immediate pleasure. And so you sacrifice that moment, that possibility, in order to be bound to a relationship, right? So you can imagine that at multiple levels, like that kind of decision. That's the kind of decision that I'm talking about, which is that you're sacrificing immediate. I mean, it's just like delayed satisfaction, but I mean, you can think of it even at a higher level. It's not just that you delay it for later; you're giving it up towards something higher, something more that is less bodily pleasure, but it is a more kind of spiritual pleasure, you could say.
Yeah. So we're not going to have enough time to actually go into the Bible and religion the way that I would like to, because I was raised very Christian, doing Bible study, hanging out with my bros, talking about Jesus, sharing scriptures and such. Then got into like psychedelics and kind of Buddhism and like other versions of isms, and that kind of the concept of like hell seems quite unreasonable. So I wonder your perspective on the how literal could one take the Bible from your perspective? Like, is it meant to be symbolism, metaphor, allegory? Is it meant to be 100% literal? How does one define how literal the Bible is?
So
or the Quran,
or mean like the literal thing? I hate that word. First of all, the word literal means according to the text. Like that's what the word literal means. People think that the word literal means that what is described is a description of events in the way that I think events should be described. And sometimes I'm not even sure what that is. It's like the way that you would describe events to a police officer, maybe, like if it was the scene of a crime, some kind of forensic, like encyclopedic description of an event. Like that's what it should be. And so we think that when we say the Bible is literal, then that's what we're describing. And I think that that's just not what's going on there. Right? The Bible is definitely a description of events, but it's not trying to describe those events in a way that would satisfy a modern rationalist in any way. Like it is a description of events which compresses elements together in order to make them meaningful over a very long span of time. And so because of that, they have a certain form and a certain trope, which is necessary. Because if you don't do that, if you don't compress elements of a story into something like universal imagery, then no one's going to understand it. So think about like if someone watched someone from the 15th century watch Pulp Fiction, like they would have no idea what they're watching. Like, what am I watching? What are these things people have in their hands? And what are these things that people are drawing, like putting up their nose, or like, what are they, what is this? Like, this doesn't mean anything because it's so idiosyncratic. In the Bible, what you have is you have stories that have been compressed and condensed and are telling the events in a way that that's just what it is. And so the idea that the first chapter of Genesis is like could be seen as a scientific description is absolute nonsense. Like, it's complete nonsense. And so I'm sorry to all the creationists who think that that's what's going on there. It's just not. It's just not. And but the problem is that it doesn't have to be. The idea that that's what's valuable, the idea that a scientific description of an event is what is supremely valuable and everything should conform to that standard is pure nonsense. And so the description of, let's say, the creation in the first chapter of Genesis is, I think, is the most powerful and accurate description of the manner in which the world exists. But it is not doing it in a way that, like I said, it's not a biologist description. It's a description of a hierarchy of meaning, a hierarchy of participation, the centrality of consciousness, the centrality of recognizing the good in the world. These things have nothing to do with what, let's say, have very little to do with the way that a kind of forensic description would be. So I think that all the stories in Scripture have to be taken very seriously. They have to be taken seriously as a description of events, but we don't have to figure out what the mechanical causes are behind some of the things that are there. So people are like reading. So like, I don't know, you read in the book of Joshua that the sun stopped, for 24 hours. And people are like, well, how is that possible? Trying to figure out like how the earth could move and what this could happen. How could I describe the mechanical causation of that? It's like, dude, stop it. What are you doing? Who cares? There's a reason why things are described that way. The reason have to do with their meaning. And so you don't have to understand what it is that if you had a video camera, you would be filming and you could capture on a video camera. But it also doesn't mean that what it's saying is just something someone made up. It's a description of something in a way that emphasizes its meaning, and it's a kind of mythological language. But in the Bible, at least, they're describing some kind of event, maybe from a distance, maybe from several generations after, maybe from that type of memory, but it is a memory of something.
Yeah, I have an analogy, and it's too bad we only have a little bit of time left because I feel like this would be, I'm like unpacking something that would be probably several hours of conversation. So maybe we can come back another time or something. But an example that's come to mind is like last night. I've been writing my dreams down. Last night I had a dream where I was like in this German war zone scenario, and I was like on my hands and knees and crawling around through puddles and hiding behind car tire things, and I had a gun and I like lost the gun and I was trying to find the gun, and then I had to report back. It was all this stuff. And within that, I think if I were to like retrace and be like, okay, I need to understand this dream, so I'm going to go to Germany, I'm going to try to find this place, I'm going to try to like encounter this guy. It's like, no, like no, it was like, there was truth.
Like which gun it is.
There was like truth within the dream. It just wasn't exactly as literal as like your waking consciousness may want to define it as. Is kind of what I'm maybe perhaps gathering, and that might be a little bit of a stretch, but
even like your waking consciousness now. So think about how right now, let's say around you, there's millions of things happening at the same time. There's like billions and billions of things happening simultaneously around you. And so in order for you to make sense of that, you have to draw phenomena into coherent, through a coherent line. So even if it's just your day, like you went through your day, you get home, like there are millions of things that happen to you that day, like millions and millions and millions. And so, but then you tell the story of your day. What you're going to do is you're going to compress. You're going to take the elements that are meaningful and you're going to compress them together in a manner in which you are going to show the line that connects these elements together. Okay, so that's how we do it. Now think of that now over 1,000 years instead of over one day. Think of how I can do that in a manner in which I would have to tell the story of my day to someone in 1,000 years.
Hmm.
And so there's a kind of compression that happens. And that compression doesn't mean that it's, like I said, it doesn't mean that you didn't have a day or that, but it means that there are so many examples that I could give you. But like, let's say a simple example would be, let's say in that story of the German story, your dream, you're trying to tell that to someone. You're trying to tell that to someone who's a Maasai in Kenya, right? From 500 years ago. And so are you going to say you had a gun? No, you're going to say I had a weapon, right? You're going to say something like I had a weapon in my hands. But that Maasai, they only understand a weapon to be something like a lance.
But they might have the same dream or a totally different dream with the same like undercurrent of truth.
They'll have
about it.
they'll have a lance in their hand instead of a gun.
Yeah.
And so that's the type of contraction that I'm saying. It's like if I say a sword, that has way more power than if I say a Glock, because a Glock is like a super reduced version. And even if I say a gun is better than if I name like the brand of the thing. It's like it's this compression of elements that is what ancient storytelling was doing and is what you find in scripture. So some of them reach levels that are so high, like a serpent, like a tree, like a garden. These elements are now universal and so compressed.
I'm going to ask about something just to generally like put it into the ether to reflect upon. I'm curious your perception of things like the ancient fertility cults, like the sacred mushroom and the cross book, the John Allegro book, and Eleusinian mysteries, and all of like the mystery cults of Greece, etc., and the potential of ergot or LSD being used to as like these like death and rebirth ceremonies. And a lot of what we gather from the Bible, in fact, has influence from the psychedelic experience and conflation of these different like ancient practices into what we now call, Bible and God and death and rebirth. And
well, let me say this. I think that it is
in 60 seconds. What do you think about that?
60 seconds. What do I think about that? No, but what I do think is that it is exactly an image of the reductionism at which we've arrived in terms of modern scientism, which is that we want to find the substance. What's the chemical? Like, what's the chemical? What's the binding thing? What's the medicine? And that's what we think is happening. So the whole psychedelic Eleusinian Mysteries things is hilarious. I find it just hilarious, which is that the Eleusinian Mysteries lasted 3 days, 4 days of nonstop like rituals, all like that would take you through an entire process that was extremely complex and that no one knows about because everybody has kept it a secret. And then you get to the end of it, and then you have a final revelation. Now, whether or not that revelation might have been supplemented by some chemical is possible. But the idea that that's what it is absolutely ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. And even people who talk about the psychedelics, it's like, how about if we let's at least talk about the vision instead of talking about the stupid mushroom. Like it's like they just, people get obsessed with the stupid mushroom. It's like, let's at least talk about the vision and see the coherence of the vision across the different traditions. Let's at least talk about that. But the idea that, so for example, like the thing that's closest to the so-called mystery cults right now in the world is the Christian liturgy. That's the closest thing that you can have, because it is a death and rebirth ritual through baptism. It is a movement into a scandalous mystery, which is the Eucharist, a revelation at the end of participation and eating the body of a God. Like that's what Christianity is. But the idea that if we could just have psychedelics,
like, well, no.
It's like,
that's more just like an interesting kind of thing to hang to, like a handle to grab onto. It's like, oh, interesting. But I think that there's like ordeal poisoning, like in the form of like fasting, and there's like the sun dance, Native American sun dance thing, or you're fasting for several days and you're dancing around a tree, and then you're hung from the tree and you're going through this like death and rebirth, like losing of the body. You're finally coming to a point where your body is so drained, you think you're on the edge of transitioning out of the body, and suddenly there's this like, oh, okay, I'm rebirthed again. I'm born again. Like that, I think that happens in many different scenarios. Like a rite of passage in culture is very common, but it's something that, I don't know that there's a definitive rite of passage in Western culture for the most part, but it doesn't need to be psychedelics per se, just
Right.
something.
Well, we have something called baptism, which is that, and it is definitely a death and rebirth. There's also the idea of reaching these states through fasting is probably much better, because the problem with the psychedelics, and I can see it, is that at least my encounter with people that have just done psychedelics is that I don't think they come back with, not sure they come back with much. Like, I'm not that impressed with the things that I've heard people come back with. Some of it seems really confused. Like, some of it seems, because it's like you rip the veil off and then you enter into a world of encounters with, let's say, transpersonal beings. But it's like there are all kinds of transpersonal beings. Like, it's not as if everything that exists in the invisible is there to help you and is good. Like, that's not true. And so
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of, and so I'm not totally discounting it. Like, I'm not saying that it's evil or whatever. I just am not super impressed. And like, I'm not impressed at what psychedelics did in the 60s to our culture. And I am very wary about them coming back right now, because we're in a worse place than we were in the 60s. Like, we are in a more disjointed, broken, narcissistic space than people were in the 60s. So imagining that coming back, I don't know, man.
I mean, it'd be tough. And now it's becoming like more of like a passionate conversation, and now we're gonna close it. But I mean, it's tough to say that anything as an absolute. Like, you could, like, there's suggestions that Francis Crick, part of his discovery of the triple helix model, was a product of him using, I think it was LSD, and taking this huge, massive information that he's been aggregating, and then through that psychedelic experience, or whatever you want, psychedelic's another one of those words, kind of like spirit or God or whatever. It's got a lot of flakes on it. Those seemingly like disparate connections that he was in these different tunnels suddenly like fused for a moment, and then he comes out of that experience because he's done so much work in his other world.
Yeah, so you could understand it. You could understand that that's probably what something that the Eleusinian mysteries were offering.
Yeah.
They would create a massive ritual that lasted several days, and then in the last moment they would use some supplement, and that would. So you can imagine, like, there's a little residue of that in Christian communion, especially in the monastic sphere, where someone would be fasting probably for a whole day, or at least maybe more, before they would take communion. And then there would be a little bit of that in terms of obviously it's not psychedelic, but a little bit of, let's say, a little help to kind of break down some things with taking wine after having fasted for a few days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the confusion as well could make sense. The sensation of like, oh, like what you're saying doesn't feel so cogent. And perhaps within some of those, I don't know, like super conscious states, for lack of better words, maybe a person kind of stumbles in territory that's not as effable as like what they would read or regurgitate out of a book. And it's kind of like,
yeah, well, they don't. People rarely talk about the bad trip. Like, people don't talk about the bad trips for some reason, because, I mean, I have witnessed people in my surrounding kind of just go down that route. And I mean, I don't know if it's because they were already psychologically fragile, but like,
Sure.
I watched them break apart. Like, I've watched them
Yep.
go into a psychotic state.
Yep.
As soon as really hard things started to present themselves to them. So yeah, so I think that I do worry about this whole resurgence of psychedelics right now. I worry about it, because I'm afraid people are going to see it as an easy way in. It's like, well, just take this pill. You know what? You want to know what spirituality is? Just take this pill.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to say there.
Because well, at least for some people, it seems to be that like.
Certainly, you can. I think a person can develop a dependence on, a clergy person can develop a dependence on the idea of God, and then wearing that as a mask, and putting on the robe and putting on the cross, and there's that exists. A spiritual person can do that with the beads. Like there's a lot of different versions of that, and someone could wear an ayahuasca root around their neck, and like that's their thing, and they go back and they do their own psychedelic baptism every 6 months, but they don't actually resource themselves in their waking life to be able to fulfill some of the lessons that they garnered during that experience. So they just go back to their previous momentum, and that's when it becomes kind of bullshitty, where it's like, no, like the window gets opened in various different ways. You could have a near-death experience. You could fall in love. You could eat way too many mushrooms, or whatever. And you're like, wow, like the window is out. The veil has been thinned, and now the window closes. Now, what do you do with it? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the difference between someone that's like a Michael Pollan, for example, where people seem to like respect his perspective, and like the Rainbow Gathering person that still doesn't have a job and still isn't really like that effective in society. Which effective, I don't really like. That's a dumb thing to say, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So that's there's nuance to everything, including religion, including the psychedelic experience, including everything.
Yeah. Well, I've never done psychedelics, so I'm definitely not. I want to be careful that I'm not being too harsh. But I do see, like I don't know. I do see that it's the fact that it's so public and everybody's talking about it so publicly. I think it worries me.
For good reason.
Even at the time of if there was part of something like the Eleusinian Mysteries, and if it was part of some of the rituals that existed in the past, and it would always have been like secret. It would always have been something that was kept, because it's also very dangerous.
And it doesn't get conflated into like an egoic badge of honor, which then it's kind of tripping back into that previous momentum of, egotism or whatever. Now suddenly the ego is so strong that you had so much momentum in that. Now you're taking this divine, in quotations, or maybe not in quotations, experience, and you're actually leveraging the divine to bolster the ego. And that's like, all right, what do we do with that? And then, that's a whole other conversation. Yeah. Thanks, man. I hope
I'm gonna. Good. Yeah, I need to go now, but it was good. It was good to meet you. It took me in surprising places.
Good times. Is there a place that people ought to be directed to go from here if they want to go deeper into your stuff? You have podcasts and YouTube, and
people can check out the symbolicworld.com. That's my website, and that's where you'll find most of the I have a presence on YouTube, and there's a podcast version of what I'm doing, and there's a group, like a kind of community of people around that are writing articles about this kind of symbolic thinking, a symbolic vision of the world. So yeah, people can check that out.
Great. Thank you, man. At some point, would love to run it back and maybe start with the
Bible stuff.
Start with the Bible stuff.
Sure. Why not?
All right. That is it. That is all. Thank you all for tuning in. And I'll see you all soon.